Good morning, everyone. I am Ali Angula. I am the Managing Director of Leap Holdings. And I'm very honored today to speak to you on a topic that's very, very close to my heart. I've written it down as part of my keynote address to you for the Manufacturing in Durban for 2021. And I'm very excited to just share my views on this topic that is very, very close to my heart. And my aim is to inspire every listener to this keynote address to aspire to make something, to produce something, to manufacture something. More than some 10 years ago, I was exposed to the Africa we do not want on a visit to Zimbabwe. Unbeknownst to me, I was favored by God to have seen it before when it resembled the Africa we want and need. And at that time, it was considered to be the breadbasket of Africa. It had a massive manufacturing industry and it had a stable currency, had a stable economy, and really did resemble the Africa we want and need. And I got to experience both. And many times I've wondered after the incident on that trip, how it came about that one of the shining star nations on the African continent finds itself on its knees economically. On my flight, returning back from that trip to my home base to Windhoek, Namibia, I was fortunate enough to have borrowed from a friend in Zimbabwe a book authored by Dabiso Moyo titled Dead Aid. I was fascinated by the subtitle, which said, "Why aid is not working and how there's another way for Africa." Personally, I do believe that there is another way for Africa, another way that can, in some big part, play to help our societies to work towards becoming a more successful society. And being on the African continent, we are made up of a lot of societies that are not successful. And we've got some islands of success in the likes of South Africa, although not as what we would define globally as success, but certainly on the African continent as an island of success. We've got Botswana, we've got Rwanda. So it certainly goes to show that as the African continent, we've got the potential of doing things differently to have more successful societies. I recently read an interview whereby James A. Robinson, a UK economist, said that successful countries, in our view, are just countries that manage to generate higher levels of living standards for their people, and failed countries are countries that don't, where there's mass poverty and deprivation. He further continued that he said that whether or not a nation succeeds or fails depends on how the people in that society organize themselves, how they organize that society, how they organize their institutions, the rules that create different patterns of incentives and opportunities. And I would like to share with you from the recent research that's been done in terms of just how countries are ranked economically. And I will correlate that to how they rank in terms of manufacturing output to the global manufacturing pool. And what I hope to demonstrate by the end of that is manufacturing is an important subsector of any economy. And more so, it is so important that it has driven these economies to be the top 10 economic powerhouses that they are today. The very first one on the chart is the United States. And just coming in second is China. And after that, it is Japan. It followed by Germany, the United Kingdom, followed by India, France, Italy, Canada, and South Korea. Now, these are the top 10 countries in terms of GDP globally, in terms of how they rank economically. Now, if I correlate that to how they rank in terms of global output when it comes to manufacturing, number one, which is the United States, ranks number two in terms of global output, putting into the global production pool 16.8%. of what we consume. China comes in number one at 28.7%. Japan, which is number three economically, comes in at position number three. So it occupies both the position in terms of where it ranks in terms of GDP and both in terms of global output when it comes to manufacturing. The same position that is occupied by Germany, which is number four, is the same position that it occupies in terms of global manufacturing output. Number five, which is the United Kingdom in terms of GDP, comes in number 9 in terms of manufacturing output. But that I would like to correlate to the fact that it was the first major manufacturing nation. So even if it comes in at number 9 and globally in terms of GDP is number 5, they build their economy off the foundation of manufacturing, and still rank in the top 10 of manufacturing countries to this day. India, which is ranked second or sixth in terms of GDP, global GDP, is coming in at number 5 when it comes to the global output in terms of manufacturing. France, which is number 7, comes in number 8 in terms of manufacturing output. Italy, which is number 8, comes in at number 7 in terms of global manufacturing output. Canada, I haven't looked at their ranking. They're much lower than the rest of the countries that are on the top 10, but come in and I'm sure they're not very far off. South Korea, which is number 10 in terms of GDP, is number 6 on our ranking. And then the number 10th country in terms of the global output is Indonesia, and it comes in at level 15 in terms of the size of its economy. So all of them very closely correlated in terms of the size of their GDP to the size of their global manufacturing output in terms of manufacturing. So I think it cannot be understated that these nations have built their economy on the back of manufacturing. And anybody that thinks you can go about it differently, I think would be misleading themselves, because data just does not lie. And the fact that we've got the very same countries in the top 10 as manufacturing countries, with the exception of one, which is Indonesia, ranked in position 10, but still is ranked number 15 in terms of the size of the economy, it goes to say that makers, and certainly says to me, makers, or let's call these maker nations, have found a way to organize their society, organize their institutions, and have the rules that create different patterns of incentive and opportunities for manufacturing, and those incentives and opportunities and the way they've organized their societies, as well as their institutions, have supported the economic growth of their countries underpinned by manufacturing. I think the data is very clear. And so with these ideas from the Dabiso Moyo's book, After This Experience, and clearly demonstrated by data that manufacturing is important to any nation, and that these nations that are maker nations are the nations that have grown economically and have been able to produce a society for their people that is a successful society, a prosperous society. I then wanted for myself to be an actor. And so I set out to put into action what she proposed in that book. And that book came to me at a time where I was really perplexed on reflection of what had happened to me in Zimbabwe. I was a visitor to that country, but the incident led me to think that there is a better way for Africa. And it was at the time when the economy had totally collapsed. And we ended up in a situation where there was a bribe that was being extracted from us. And I thought to myself, the level of the bribe that was being extracted at the hour that it was being extracted, the people that were extracting it, surely this is not a position that they would like to find themselves in. And because I had the benefit of having seen Zimbabwe at a time where it was prosperous with a huge manufacturing base, it said to me there had to be a better way. At the time, I was a partner at a large auditing, advisory and tax firm in Namibia. And when I set out to endeavor into doing something and become an actor in the economy, many people, including many of my friends, thought I had some form of trauma shock from the incident. And it is this that was driving me to taking what appeared to be a rather irrational, ill-thought-out decision. And that was the decision to leave my partnership and all its whistles and go and become a garment manufacturer. Well, I didn't start out wanting to become a garment manufacturer. I started out wanting to put to action what was proposed in that book by an economist. Last night, my husband made a comment that went something like this. You know, my family, today I discovered that there are businesses that are called unicorns. They are started, they grow so fast heading for the stratosphere. They are called unicorns. I'm baffled by all these economic terms. The clever people are always talking about the economy this and the economy that, etc. And that the economy is failing to create that and this job. But all I know is that every person wants to have a good life, put food on the table for their families, have a roof over their heads, have the ability to send their children to school. And they don't eat, nor do they get jobs from this economy, jargon, etc. And although I had read this book and moved by it and wanting to do something different and wanting to become an actor, this book that was written by an economist, what he said last night, and having thought that I'm giving this keynote address today, resonated so well with me that I was reminded of how my journey in creating jobs started. Without the economic jargon, but very much part of the economic story of my nation. Because when I first set out, all I really wanted to do was create manufacturing jobs, because I had a deep conviction that manufacturing creates wealth for nations, full stop. Now, I have given the data in terms of which are the top 10 powerhouses in terms of the economy, in terms of their GDP globally. I have correlated that to where they rank in terms of global manufacturing output. All of them, bar one country in terms of manufacturing output, are all ranked very close to their ranking in terms of GDP and very closely correlated to their position in terms of global output in terms of manufacturing. So full stop, manufacturing creates wealth for nations. When we started in my manufacturing story, our manufacturing story, because manufacturing creates wealth, and that became my focus, I started out researching many things that I could make, or that we could make as a company, that we could make economically for a profit, that had the potential to employ many people. And we eventually settled on the garment industry. And I was fortunate to have met a family member of the Hydromeni family, which is very big in the garment industry. And I met them by chance, again, God orchestrating things. And I met them by chance in London. I was wanting to understand, how do you raise funding for this big dream that I had in terms of this manufacturing business that I wanted to start, and I needed to start because I had that conviction. And they invited me over to their factory, one of their factories in Sri Lanka. And when I saw it, I was just so convinced that it met all the criteria and then some, in addition to what we had set up as the original criteria in terms of the manufacturing industry that we're going to get into. So we ended up in the garment industry. It's been 7 years since, and we have a scarce script for an entire TV show. We've got the T-shirt for it. It's been quite a journey. And as we enter our next season in the journey of Leap Empire, which is being birthed by God's grace from Leap Holdings, we are so excited to remain makers, and we want to inspire the next generation of makers in our nation, on the African continent, to God's glory. Today, though, I want to talk to us about becoming a nation of makers in our respective nations. And I just want to start this off by saying, what is a nation of makers? Many of our nations on the African continent do not have the construct of a nation of makers because of the way that we have organized ourselves through patronage and rent-seeking politics, institutions that have been hijacked to favor the few, and institutions that have been injured and left damaged by the consequences of corruption, both by the corruptor, which is normally a private enterprise, and the corruptee, which is normally a public sector official. Our incentive and opportunities arrangements in many of our nations are not inclusive and only accessible by the few. However, even with the current arrangements, I still firmly believe that once we recognize and label ourselves as makers, we can turn that into a nation of people that inherently from birth are makers and have the makings of a nation of makers. Many might be wondering why the manufacturing industry, I'm choosing to use the word maker. I believe that words create our world. I believe that certain words have framed people out from certain industries. I would be dismayed to think that a potential manufacturer is today missing the opportunity to listen to these wonderful speakers at the manufacturing endeavor because they did not view themselves, and they do not view themselves as manufacturers. And my intention is to get as many people to recognize their inherent disposition as a manufacturer by starting to demonstrate that we all are, and we all have the potential of being manufacturers, but currently we are makers at different levels of output. When we progress in the value chain of making things, we can progress our nations. So my aim is to get as many people to aspire to getting our nations to think as nations of makers, a nation of manufacturers, a nation of producers. So what is a maker? The dictionary defines a maker as a person or a thing that makes or produces something. A constructor, a founder, a creator, a producer, an inventor, an author, a builder, a composer, a manufacturer. Once we recognize our potential and our rightful heritage as makers, we will then turn our attention to the organization of our society, our institutions, and the rules that provide the incentives and opportunities for us to succeed and thrive. Recognizing that our current arrangement of these is currently not conducive to produce the appropriate outcomes for a society that is prospering and that is successful. When a nation can frame what it is, we can, from this starting point, organize our education system to provide to us makers, us the manufacturers, us the inventors, us the producers, to provide to us the skills that we require as we ramp up production in our maker nations. We will realize that instead of investing only in certain qualifications, for example, I'll use Namibia for example, we've got a lot of people that have qualified as geologists because we've got minerals. And so many African countries have got minerals. And therefore we've got these geologists that have qualified, they've got the skills, exploration geologists. But I dare to say we will want and need as a nation of makers to invest in material scientists, for instance. These are people that will experiment with our materials, our raw materials from our natural endowments of minerals, our gems, and other natural resources to show us the potential of what we can make from what we have. Now, there are other nations, the nations that produce, the nations that recognize that they are a nation of makers, that do have these professions, material scientists. I've met many of them. I have not met one who originates and who is from the African continent. And I would love to meet one in the future. But once we recognize that we are nations of makers, our children will aspire, our education system will gear behind our profession of manufacturers, and we will produce these careers, these skills that are supportive of manufacturers. We will also look at how our system of protecting intellectual property rights is arranged. We will demand a procurement system by our states that encourages innovation rather than discourages innovation. We could even end up where it is constitutionally protected in terms of intellectual property and incentive schemes that will work towards creating inclusive opportunities to all inventors in our society. This arrangement is working very well for the biggest economy in the world. In fact, when the patent board was formed in the US, the president in office at that time, Jefferson, was on that board. That's how important they considered it. They are reaping the benefits of it today and have for many, many years. And therefore, once we get to understand that we need to arrange our societies to fit what we want to become, and I'm proposing today that we need to say to ourselves that we are a nation of makers. And once we do that, we organize our societies, we organize our institutions, we organize our incentive and our opportunities to align to that, very well knowing that we are going to reap the benefits because there are nations that have gone before us that have reaped the benefits. So back to the point that I really would like all of us to take away. And that is the point that we are all makers. And I'd like to reference where we as human beings started and why it is our heritage. I'm wearing today my traditional Oshiwambo dress. And I'm wearing it today because it represents my heritage. I'm wearing it today because it resonates with the talk that I'm delivering today, which is, it is our heritage as humankind, as mankind to be creators. It is our heritage as humankind to be makers of things, to be manufacturers. It is our heritage. It is our natural position. It is not something that we are inheriting. It is not something that superheroes do or superhuman beings do. It is not some inventor that is out there. It is our heritage. And I'd like to just demonstrate that. In Genesis 1, verse 6, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, it says, God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Now, it's a mouthful, but the message is we are made in the image of who? A creator. And where does that come from? When I'm saying we're made in the image of a creator. In Genesis 1, verse 1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And he's made us in his likeness, meaning if he is a creator and he's given us dominion over all the things that he has created, for sure, we have been made to make things that provide sustenance, that provide shelter, that provide clothing, that provide transportation, that provide entertainment, that provide education, that provide comfort to us as human beings. And when all of that is organized in a way that is done at a profit, and it doesn't have to be an extractive type of profit, it just needs to be done where there is a return and you can reinvest back in what you're doing. That is how you have a nation that is prosperous. But the foundation is that it is a nation of makers. And because words create and frame our worldview in our world, and I firmly believe that as human beings, we are conditioned. We're not born the way that we end up, we are conditioned. Our society or ourselves, though I feel have managed to miseducate us on who is a manufacturer, such that we only view companies such as car makers, high industrial manufacturing, such as high industrial manufacturing as manufacturing to the detriment of other producing activities within our societies, undermining our potential and the potential of these subsectors of manufacturing. I contest that as people, we are all wired to be makers, to be manufacturers, to be producers, because I view my friend who bakes a cake as a maker. I view my friend who sews clothing as a maker. I view any person, a friend of mine who mixes chilies in their kitchen, they are a maker. Anybody that churns butter in their kitchen, they are a maker. Any person that takes one item and by doing something, makes something from it, that person is a maker. Making things is inherent in us. It is our DNA as human beings. So framing this is important because every journey, I believe, of 1,000 miles was started by one single step. So when we start framing who is a maker, and I call them their due recognition as the manufacturer, soon we will have many individuals organizing themselves as such, as manufacturers, persons who will be seeking and demanding for the right skills for their businesses, driving an evolution of our skills that we produce as nations, demanding the appropriate financing for their endeavors, our endeavors as makers, demanding for the appropriate incentives, etc., in as far as taxation and other incentives to make us competitive and consequently to make our nations competitive. Just imagine for a moment how far we would have moved towards our heritage when we focus on conditioning ourselves as makers, as producers, as manufacturers, when we start with our little ones from young, in the creches, in our homes, on our TV shows, teaching and illustrating to them our heritage as mankind, that heritage as makers. Where would we be today? I reckon further than where we are today. Imagine the potential that will be unleashed when from the time we can reason as human beings, we are shown that things around us are made by other human beings just like us, that are not superhuman beings. And therefore, that if anybody can do it, that our natural position is that of inventors by nature. And what we have done is we have nurtured it out. So my call is for us to recognize ourselves as human beings, that by nature we are innovators, by nature we are makers. And in closing, I'm very excited. I'm super excited, in fact, about the potential of our makers. I'm excited about the potential of our manufacturing sectors, because once potential is recognized, it is impossible to try and push it back into a bottle. It is impossible to rebottle. It is impossible to constrain. And once the society is challenged, it is inevitable that the arrangement of the day, which is not working, will fail and will be replaced by the arrangement of a society that is premised on the inherent position of every human being, that of a maker, a manufacturer. Thank you very much.